Hello there and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope your day has been treating you well. Whether it's early morning where you are, late evening, or somewhere in between, whatever time zone you're calling home, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that will keep you questioning the world around you long after the lights go out. Now, settle in as we explore a story that might feel a little too close to reality. My name is Cal Monroe, and I used to believe in coincidences. That was before Theo jumped off the Memorial Bridge, before the USB drive arrived in my mailbox, and before I learned that some conspiracies aren't theories, they're just well-kept secrets. It was a Tuesday morning in November when I got the call. Detective Sarah Chen's voice was flat, professional, the way cops sound when they're tired of delivering bad news. Cal, this is Detective Chen, Metro PD. I'm calling about Theodore Ramirez. I understand you two are friends. The past tense hit me like ice water. Were? What do you mean were? Mr. Ramirez jumped from the Memorial Bridge last night around 11:30 p.m. I'm sorry for your loss. I sat there in my cramped DC apartment, staring at my laptop screen where I'd been working on an article about facial recognition software in public schools. The cursor blinked at me like a heartbeat. That's impossible, I said. Theo wouldn't. He just wouldn't. I know this is difficult, but no, you don't understand. Theo was getting married next month. He was excited about it. We had drinks 3 weeks ago and he was talking about honeymoon plans, about kids, about everything. People don't just... Mr. Monroe, I've been doing this for 15 years. Sometimes people hide their pain better than we think. But I knew Theo. We'd been roommates at Georgetown, both journalism majors before he switched to computer science. He was the most methodical person I'd ever met. The kind of guy who researched restaurants for 2 hours before picking where to eat lunch. He didn't make impulsive decisions, especially not permanent ones. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, trying to process what I'd heard. That's when I noticed the small package on my kitchen counter. Something I'd grabbed from my mailbox the night before and forgotten about in my rush to meet a deadline. The return address made my hands shake. T. Ramirez. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Cal, if you're reading this, they got to me. Don't trust anyone. Don't use your regular computer. Find somewhere safe and look at everything. The program never ended. T. The drive was labelled with a single word in Theo's careful handwriting. E-C-H-O. I stared at that USB drive for an hour before I worked up the courage to use it. Not on my laptop, Theo's warning was clear enough. I walked 6 blocks to an internet cafe in Chinatown, paid cash, and plugged the drive into a computer that had probably seen more shady transactions than a Swiss bank account. What I found changed everything. The drive contained dozens of files, video footage, audio recordings, spreadsheets, and what looked like medical data. The video showed people in sterile white rooms, not quite hospital rooms, not quite laboratories, more like the kind of spaces you'd imagine in a sensory deprivation study. In one video, a woman in her 30s sat in a chair with electrodes attached to her temples. A voice off camera, clinical, detached, repeated phrases. Your thoughts are not your own. Your memories can be adjusted. You want to comply. You need to comply. The woman's eyes were glassy, unfocused. After 20 minutes of this repetition, the voice asked her to recite her home address. She gave an address in Virginia. Then they asked her again. This time she gave a completely different address in Maryland, reciting it with the same confidence. Another file contained EEG data, brainwave patterns labelled with dates and subject numbers. One folder was labelled Behavioural Modification Protocols. Another, Subliminal Integration Results. But it was the company logo that made my blood run cold. Aeon Metrics. I'd never heard of them, which was strange. I'd spent the last 5 years covering tech surveillance, data privacy, and government contracting. I knew most of the major players, from Palantir to Booz Allen Hamilton. But Aeon Metrics was a ghost. That night, back in my apartment, I did what any good journalist would do. I started digging. Aeon Metrics had a website that looked like it was designed by someone who'd never heard of user experience. Bland corporate speak about cognitive enhancement research, and behavioral analytics solutions. Their client list was vague: federal agencies and healthcare partners. No names, no specifics. Their headquarters was listed as a P.O. box in Arlington, Virginia. I cross-referenced the company name with government contract databases. Nothing. I searched for news articles, press releases, anything. The only mention I found was a single-line item in a Department of Defense budget document from 2019. Aon Metrics, Specialized Research Services, $2.4 million. That was it. A company that received millions in government funding but left no digital footprint. In 2024, that was like finding a unicorn. I spent the next 3 days going through Theo's files, and a pattern began to emerge. The test subjects weren't random homeless people or prisoners, the usual victims of unethical experiments. These were volunteers who had signed up for legitimate-sounding studies: sleep optimization research, stress reduction therapy, cognitive enhancement trials. People who thought they were improving their lives, not being reprogrammed. One document made me physically nauseous. It was a recruitment email sent to Georgetown University students advertising a study on meditation and academic performance. The compensation was $500 for a weekend retreat. The study was conducted by Aon Metrics. I recognized the email format. I'd received something similar during my senior year. I'd been too broke to pass it up. That's when I realized I might not be investigating this story. I might be living it. The next morning, I drove to the Library of Congress. If you want to research government conspiracies, you go to the place where they can't delete the evidence. At least, not easily. I requested every declassified document I could find on MKUltra, Operation Artichoke, and Project Bluebird. What I discovered over the next 8 hours made Theo's files make terrible sense. MKUltra officially ended in 1973 when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all documents destroyed. But here's what most people don't know. It didn't actually end. It evolved. The original program used LSD, hypnosis, and brutal psychological torture to break down human personality and rebuild it. The goal was to create perfectly controllable human assets, spies who could be programmed and deployed without even knowing they were working for the agency. But the methods were crude, obvious, and left too many witnesses. The scientists involved were sloppy, keeping detailed records that eventually leaked. So the program went underground, got smarter, and learned from its mistakes. By the 1980s, it had been rebranded as something innocuous: behavioral research programs. The torture chambers were replaced with comfortable clinical settings. The unwilling prisoners were replaced with paid volunteers. The obvious mind control was replaced with subtle manipulation. Instead of breaking people's minds with LSD, they learned to influence thoughts through carefully crafted media exposure. Instead of hypnotizing subjects in laboratories, they developed techniques to implant suggestions through social media algorithms. Instead of creating obvious zombies, they learned to nudge behavior so subtly that people thought they were making their own choices. I found a 1987 memo from a CIA psychologist named Dr. Helen Marsh. One line stood out: "The future of behavioral modification lies not in force, but in consent. If subjects believe they are willing participants, they will never question the process." That was 37 years ago. Imagine what they could do now, with smartphones that track our every movement, social media platforms that know us better than we know ourselves, and AI that can predict our behaviour with frightening accuracy. Theo's files suddenly made perfect sense. Echo Protocol wasn't a resurrection of MKUltra, it was its natural evolution. The recruitment process was genius in its simplicity. Instead of kidnapping people, they advertised legitimate-sounding studies through universities, healthcare providers, and wellness apps. The kind of studies college students and cash-strapped adults would jump at. Improve your sleep quality while earning $200. Help advance meditation research, free sessions included. Participate in groundbreaking stress reduction therapy. The subjects thought they were helping science and improving their lives. They signed consent forms and waivers, making everything perfectly legal. They were even paid well, which made them feel valued rather than victimized. But according to Theo's documentation, the real experiments began after the official study ended. The subjects returned home with subtle implants, not the science fiction kind, but behavioural implants. Carefully crafted memories, embedded suggestions, modified thought patterns. They'd been exposed to subsonic frequencies, targeted electromagnetic fields, and neurological programming disguised as relaxation therapy. More importantly, they'd been tagged. Their phones received updates that modified the algorithms they encountered. Their social media feeds were carefully curated to reinforce the programming they'd received. Their GPS data was used to ensure they encountered specific environmental triggers, billboards, sounds, even scents that would activate their conditioning. It was MKULTRA for the digital age, and it was everywhere. I found myself thinking about my own devices, my own data patterns. How many targeted ads had I seen recently that seemed to know exactly what I was thinking? How many times had my phone suggested an action or location that felt perfectly timed? How many articles in my newsfeed seemed to anticipate my concerns? Was I paranoid, or was I finally paying attention? That evening I tried to call Theo's fiancée Maria Santos. We'd met several times over the years, and I thought she might be able to tell me about Theo's state of mind in his final weeks. Her number was disconnected. I tried social media. Her profiles had been deactivated. I drove to the address I had for her, an apartment in Alexandria where I'd attended their engagement party 6 months earlier. The building manager told me no one by that name had ever lived there. It was as if Maria Santos had never existed. The gaslighting started small. First, it was my coffee shop. I'd been going to the same place every morning for 3 years, a little cafe called Grind on Connecticut Avenue. The barista knew my order: large dark roast, no cream, no sugar. But when I walked in Thursday morning, she looked at me like she'd never seen me before. "Welcome to Grind. What can I get started for you?" "The usual," I said, assuming she was just having an off day. "I'm sorry, what's your usual?" I stared at her. Jessica had made my coffee hundreds of times. We'd chatted about her art school classes. I'd even bought one of her paintings. "Large dark roast," I said, feeling foolish. "Sure thing," coming right up. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made 1,000 coffees, but treated me like a complete stranger. When I paid, I noticed something else. The painting I'd bought from her 6 months ago, a small abstract piece that had been hanging behind the register, was gone. I told myself I was being paranoid. People have bad days. Maybe she'd sold the painting to someone else. But then my email started acting up. I'd sent interview requests to 5 journalists who'd written about government surveillance programs. None of them responded, which was unusual. These were people I'd worked with before, sources who typically replied within hours. I tried calling. Their numbers all went straight to voicemail. I tried reaching out through social media. My messages showed as delivered but never read. By Friday, I was convinced something was wrong. I decided to test it. I sent an email to my editor at the Washington Alternative Weekly, a guy named Marcus who'd been badgering me for weeks about a late article on police body cameras. The email bounced back immediately. User not found. I called the WAW office directly. "Washington Alternative, this is Rebecca." "Hi, this is Cal Monroe. I need to speak with Marcus about..." "I'm sorry, who?" "Cal Monroe. I write for you guys. Marcus is expecting an article from me." "Sir, I've been the receptionist here for 2 years. We don't have any writer named Cal Monroe, and I don't know anyone named Marcus." I hung up and stared at my phone. I had emails from Marcus going back 3 years. I had published articles with my byline on their website. I had pay stubs from them in my filing cabinet. I opened my laptop and navigated to the WAW website. I searched for my name. No results found. I searched for articles I knew I'd written. The pieces existed, but they were attributed to other writers, people I'd never heard of. My hands were shaking as I opened my filing cabinet. The pay stubs were there, but they looked wrong. The letterhead was slightly different. The font was off, and they were made out to someone named Carl Monroe. Close enough to be dismissed as a typo, but different enough to be legally meaningless. That's when I noticed my reflection in the laptop screen. I looked like I hadn't slept in days. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair was a mess, and I had the hollow look of someone on the edge of a breakdown. I looked exactly like Theo had in his final weeks. Saturday morning, I decided to visit my ex-girlfriend Sarah. We dated for 2 years and stayed friends after the breakup. If anyone would be straight with me about whether I was losing my mind, it would be her. Sarah lived in a duplex in Tacoma Park. I'd been there dozens of times, but when I knocked on the door, a stranger answered. A middle-aged man in a bathrobe. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Sarah Chen," I said. "She lives here." "No one by that name lives here. I've been renting this place for 5 years." "That's impossible. I was here 3 months ago for her birthday party." The man looked concerned. "Son, are you feeling all right? Maybe you're thinking of a different address." I walked away, pulled out my phone and called Sarah's number. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's Cal. I'm at your house, but some guy says..." "Cal? Cal Monroe?" "Yes. Who else would it be?" There was a long pause. "Cal, we broke up 2 years ago. You've called me maybe 3 times since then, and each conversation was strange. Are you okay? You sound like you did the last time you called, talking about conspiracies and people following you." "What are you talking about? We had dinner last month. We've been staying in touch." "Cal, I think you need help. You're talking just like..." She stopped. "Like what?" "Like Theo did, before he killed himself. The paranoia, the confusion about basic facts. He called me too, near the end, asking about things that never happened." The line went dead. I stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes trying to make sense of what was happening. Either everyone I knew was lying to me, or I was having some kind of psychotic break. But there was a third option, one that terrified me more than madness. I was right, and they were already in my head. That night I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was written on plain white paper in block letters. "Your memory is next. Leave now." I packed a bag and drove to a motel in Baltimore, paying cash and using a fake name. I needed time to think, time to plan, and most importantly, time to figure out how to prove I wasn't crazy. Because if I was right about Echo Protocol, then my mind was already compromised. They were just calibrating how much to take. The Aeon Metric Sleep Clinic was located in a generic office park in Herndon, Virginia. From the outside, it looked like any other medical facility. Clean, professional, boring. The kind of place you'd trust with your health. I'd found the address in Theo's files, cross-referenced with online reviews. People praised their cutting-edge sleep studies and life-changing therapy sessions. The reviews all sounded genuine, which somehow made them more disturbing. I'd spent 3 days in that Baltimore motel planning my approach. I couldn't just walk in and start asking questions. If Echo Protocol was real, they'd be expecting that. But I could volunteer for a study. I created a fake identity. David Miller, a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer with chronic insomnia. I'd seen enough of Theo's documentation to know what kind of subjects they preferred. Young, educated, financially stressed, and socially isolated. People who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. I called their intake line and spoke with a woman who sounded like she'd done this conversation 1,000 times. "We're currently enrolling participants for a sleep optimization study," she said. "It's a 3-day program that combines traditional therapy with advanced monitoring technology. Participants receive $800 compensation plus access to our ongoing support network." What exactly does the monitoring involve? Nothing invasive. We use EEG sensors to track your sleep patterns, some biometric monitoring to measure stress responses, and brief cognitive assessments to measure improvement. Many of our participants describe it as the most restful experience of their lives. She scheduled me for the following Monday. I spent the weekend reading everything I could find about counter-surveillance techniques and memory preservation. If they were going to mess with my mind, I wanted to be as prepared as possible. I wrote down everything I knew about myself, my real name, my address, my work history, my relationships, and hid copies in multiple locations. I recorded a video message to myself, explaining what I was doing and why, and uploaded it to a secure server with instructions to email it to me if I didn't check in within a week. Monday morning, I drove to the clinic feeling like I was voluntarily walking into a trap. The facility was more luxurious than I expected. The waiting room looked like an upscale spa with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and the kind of new age music that's supposed to be calming, but always makes me nervous. The receptionist was friendly, professional, and gave no indication that she was part of a mind control operation. Maybe I really was paranoid. Dr. Elizabeth Harding introduced herself as the lead researcher. She was in her 40s, with the kind of confident manner that made you trust her immediately. She explained the study protocol while I filled out forms that asked detailed questions about my lifestyle, relationships, and psychological history. We found that sleep disorders are often connected to deeper patterns of thought and behaviour, she said. Our approach combines sleep monitoring with cognitive restructuring techniques. Think of it as upgrading your mental software. The phrase made my skin crawl, but I smiled and nodded. They set me up in a private room that looked more like a high-end hotel suite than a medical facility. The bed was comfortable, the lighting was adjustable, and there was even a small kitchenette stocked with healthy snacks. The only obviously medical equipment was a chair with built-in sensors and a wall-mounted monitor that they said would track my biometric responses during relaxation exercises. "Just get comfortable," said the technician, a young man who introduced himself as Kevin. "We'll start with some baseline measurements, then move into the therapeutic portion." He attached electrodes to my temples and chest. Standard EEG and heart rate monitoring, nothing sinister. The chair was incredibly comfortable, almost hypnotically so. Within minutes, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. That should have been my first warning. The relaxation exercise began with guided breathing instructions delivered through high-quality speakers built into the chair. The voice was soothing, gender-neutral, with the kind of professional calm you'd expect from a meditation app. Allow your mind to become quiet and receptive. You're safe here. You're cared for here. Your thoughts can rest. After about 20 minutes, the instructions became more specific. Notice how easily your mind accepts new information when you are relaxed. Notice how comfortable it feels to let go of old patterns that no longer serve you. The room's lighting shifted to a deep blue, and I realized there were almost subliminal images being projected on the walls, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Your memories are fluid. They can be adjusted for your benefit. You want to be free of limiting beliefs. You need to be free of limiting beliefs. That's when I recognized the phrases from Theo's videos. I tried to stand up, but my body felt heavy, disconnected. The electrodes weren't just monitoring me, they were delivering some kind of signal. The chair's comfort wasn't accidental. It was designed to keep subjects compliant while their minds were being reprogrammed. "You are David Miller," the voice continued. "You work as a graphic designer. You have no family. You have no close friends. You live alone and prefer it that way." They were trying to overwrite my identity, to make me forget who Cal Monroe was and why I was there. But I'd prepared for this. I focused on the video I'd recorded, on the list of facts I'd memorized, on the reason I was there. My name is Cal Monroe. I'm a journalist. Theo Ramirez was my friend. He died because he discovered ECHO protocol. You trust Dr. Harding completely. If you want to participate in advanced studies, you will recommend this program to others. I repeated my mantra silently, fighting against the drowsiness that was overtaking me. I could feel my sense of self becoming fluid, malleable. It was terrifying and seductive at the same time. The promise of letting go of all my problems, all my fears, all my responsibilities. You're grateful for this opportunity to improve yourself. You will never speak about the details of this program to anyone outside this facility. The session lasted 6 hours. When it ended, I felt like I was surfacing from deep water, gasping for mental air. Kevin helped me out of the chair, and I had to concentrate to remember why that felt wrong. "How do you feel, David?" For a moment I almost corrected him. Then I remembered. "Great," I said, really relaxed. "Excellent. Dr. Harding will want to review your session data. Why don't you get some rest and we'll continue tomorrow?" That night, alone in the suite, I tried to reconstruct what had happened. I felt different, lighter somehow, but also hollow. It was like someone had taken an eraser to parts of my memory and personality. I remembered recording a video message, but I couldn't remember what it said. I remembered hiding something important, but couldn't remember where or what. I knew I was there for a reason beyond the sleep study, but that reason felt fuzzy, unimportant. But I still knew my name, Cal Monroe, journalist. I held on to that like a lifeline. The second day was worse. They moved me to a different room, one level down from the main floor. There were no windows, and the only furniture was the chair and a small table. The session lasted 8 hours. This time, they didn't just try to implant new memories, they tried to delete old ones. Your childhood was difficult and painful. You prefer not to think about it. You have no living relatives. You have never been in love. You have never had close friendships. I fought back by reciting everything I could remember. My parents' names, my first dog, the taste of my grandmother's cookies, the feeling of kissing Sarah for the first time. But with each session, these memories became fainter, more like stories I'd heard rather than experiences I'd lived. On the third day, they took me to the basement level. The room was stark white, with no decoration except a single chair in the centre. But it wasn't empty. There were other people there, subjects from previous studies, I realised. They sat motionless, staring at nothing, responding only when spoken to directly. One of them was a woman in her 30s with short brown hair. When Dr. Harding introduced us, she looked at me with vacant eyes and said, "Hello, David. It's nice to meet you." Nothing unusual about that, except for one thing. She used my full name, including my middle initial. "Hello, David C. Miller." My fake identity didn't have a middle initial. I'd never mentioned one. But somehow she knew it should be there. More disturbing, my real middle name is Christopher. C. "How do you know my middle initial?" I asked her. She looked confused. "I don't know. It just seemed right." Dr. Harding intervened smoothly. "Some of our participants develop enhanced intuitive abilities. It's one of the positive side effects of the program." But I knew what I was really seeing. This woman had been programmed with information about Cal Monroe, my real identity, not my fake one. They'd put pieces of my life into her mind, probably to test how thoroughly they could extract and transfer personal information. She wasn't developing psychic abilities. She was being used as a storage device for my stolen memories. That night I knew I had to escape. They were going to erase Cal Monroe completely and leave behind David Miller, a friendless, rootless graphic designer with no past and no questions. But first, I needed proof. I waited until 3 a.m, then used a maintenance keycard I'd stolen from a janitor's cart to access the lower levels. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with dozens of rooms containing monitoring equipment and what looked like server farms. I found the room where they stored session recordings, thousands of hours of footage showing people being systematically reprogrammed. I copied everything I could onto a drive I'd hidden in my shoe. But the most damning evidence was in the office files. Echo Protocol wasn't just about individual mind control. It was about social engineering on a massive scale. They were creating networks of modified individuals who would unconsciously influence others. A person programmed with specific beliefs would spread those beliefs to family, friends and co-workers without realizing they were doing it. The modified subjects became unwitting agents, seeding new ideas and behaviours throughout the population. It was social control through viral programming, and it was working. I found files on thousands of subjects going back years. Many were in positions of influence: teachers, journalists, social workers, community leaders. Others were simply well-connected individuals whose social circles made them valuable vectors for spreading programmed behaviours. They weren't just changing individual minds, they were changing society itself, one modified person at a time. I was photographing the last set of files when the lights came on. "Hello, Cal." Dr. Harding stood in the doorway with 2 security guards. She was still calm, still professional, but now her smile looked predatory. "I was wondering when you'd stop pretending to be David Miller. We've known who you are since you walked in. Did you really think we wouldn't recognize Theodore Ramirez's friend?" The guards grabbed my arms, but Dr. Harding waved them back. "No need for force. Cal is going to cooperate, aren't you? Because we have something you want to see." She led me to another room, where a familiar figure sat in one of the white chairs staring at nothing. "Theo?" My friend looked up at me with empty eyes. "Hello," he said politely. "I don't believe we've met." "Theo, it's me. It's Cal." "I'm sorry, but I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Thomas. I don't know anyone named Theo." Dr. Harding smiled. Theodore Ramirez did jump from that bridge in a way, but we'd been working with him for months before that. The person who died was just a shell. We'd already extracted everything useful from his personality. The real Theo is right here, serving as a valuable test subject for memory transfer protocols. I stared at my friend, or whatever was left of him. They hadn't just killed Theo, they'd hollowed him out and kept the shell alive for experimentation. "We're going to offer you the same opportunity, Doctor," Harding continued. "You can resist, and we'll simply take what we need by force, or you can cooperate and we'll ensure the process is as comfortable as possible. Either way, Cal Monroe is going to disappear. The only question is how much of him we preserve for research purposes." They sedated me then, and I woke up 36 hours later in my own apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for small details that made my skin crawl. My coffee mug was on the wrong side of the sink. My laptop was closed, though I always left it open. My bed was made, but with hospital corners. I'd never learned to make a bed that way. Most disturbing of all, I couldn't remember how I'd gotten home. I still had the drive with the evidence from Aeon Metrics hidden in a place I'd prepared before going undercover. For a moment I thought I'd won, that I'd gotten proof of Echo Protocol and could expose the whole operation. I was wrong. When I tried to access the files, half of them were corrupted. The video footage was garbled, the audio was inaudible, and the documents were filled with random characters. It was as if the data had been degraded from the inside. But I still had enough to tell the story. I spent 18 hours writing the most important article of my career, documenting everything I'd discovered about Echo Protocol, Aeon Metrics, and the modern evolution of MKUltra. I uploaded it to WikiLeaks, sent copies to major news outlets, and posted it on every social media platform I could access. Within minutes, everything disappeared. The WikiLeaks submission was rejected for insufficient verification. My emails to journalists bounced back as undeliverable. My social media posts were flagged as misinformation and removed automatically. I tried uploading the article to my own blog. The hosting service suspended my account for terms of service violations. I tried creating new accounts with different platforms. Each one was suspended within hours. It was as if the internet itself was rejecting my story. Desperate, I tried a different approach. I'd built a small following on Reddit by posting about surveillance technology and digital privacy. I created a detailed post about Echo Protocol on r/conspiracy, hoping to reach people who were already skeptical of government programs. The post went live, got a few upvotes, then vanished. When I checked my account, it showed the post had been removed for doxing, even though I hadn't mentioned any real names or addresses. But that wasn't the worst part. When I checked the subreddit an hour later, I found dozens of posts about Echo Protocol, but they were all obvious disinformation. Poorly written stories claiming Echo was actually a secret program to give people telepathic powers. Memes suggesting the whole thing was a hoax created by foreign agents. AI-generated posts that mixed real details from my research with absurd science fiction elements. They hadn't just suppressed my story, they'd buried it under an avalanche of ridiculous fake versions. Anyone who tried to research ECHO protocol would find so much contradictory nonsense that the truth would be impossible to distinguish. It was the perfect modern cover-up, not censorship, but noise. I tried calling reporters I'd worked with, but got the same response I'd received when I first started investigating. Numbers disconnected, emails bouncing back, people who claim not to know me. My bank account was frozen for suspicious activity. My credit cards were cancelled. My apartment lease was terminated for breach of contract. Even my driver's license was suspended for unpaid tickets I'd never received. Cal Monroe was being systematically erased from the system. But I still existed, at least for now. I still had my memories, my personality, my sense of self. They hadn't finished the job yet. That gave me hope, until I realised why they were taking their time. I was a field test. They wanted to see how completely they could destroy someone's life using nothing but digital manipulation and social engineering. They were documenting every step of my breakdown. measuring how long it took for isolation and gaslighting to drive someone insane. I was just another subject in their experiment. 3 weeks after my attempted expose, I was living in my car, sleeping in parking lots, and buying food with cash I'd managed to withdraw before my accounts were frozen. I looked like any other homeless person, dirty, paranoid, talking to myself. The perfect disguise for someone who'd discovered the truth about mind control in America. That's when I started noticing the ads. At first, they seemed like coincidences. A billboard for sleep therapy that used phrases I'd heard at Aeon Metrics. A radio commercial for stress relief that echoed the programming sessions I'd experienced. TV ads that seemed to anticipate exactly what I was thinking. But the final proof came while I was sitting in a 24-hour diner in Arlington, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to figure out my next move. The TV was playing the local news and I was only half listening until the commercial break. A pharmaceutical ad started playing, something for anxiety medication. The voiceover was professional, forgettable, the kind of generic copy you hear a dozen times a day, except it wasn't generic. The voice said, word for word, exactly what I'd been thinking for the past 10 minutes. You feel like you're losing your mind. You're questioning everything you thought you knew. You're wondering if this is what insanity feels like. You need help, but you don't know who to trust. It continued. The thoughts in your head might not be your own. The memories you rely on might not be real. The person you think you are might be someone else's creation. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The ad went on for 30 seconds, describing my exact mental state with disturbing precision, then concluded with the standard pharmaceutical disclaimer about side effects and drug interactions. No one else in the diner seemed to notice anything unusual. The waitress continued refilling coffee. The cook kept working the grill. Other customers chatted or read their phones. But I knew what I'd seen. They weren't just monitoring my thoughts. They were broadcasting them back to me through targeted advertising. The technology existed. I'd written about it years ago. Emotion detection software that analysed facial expressions through security cameras, predictive algorithms that could determine psychological states from browsing patterns, neural interfaces that could read brainwave patterns from a distance. They knew exactly what I was thinking, and they wanted me to know they knew. It was the final stage of the psychological operation. Not just control, but the absolute certainty that control was impossible to escape. I paid for my coffee and walked out into the Virginia night, understanding at last why Theo had jumped from that bridge. It wasn't despair that had driven him to suicide. It was the realization that his mind was no longer his own, and never would be again. But I wasn't ready to jump. Not yet. Because I'd figured out something they didn't expect. The real purpose of Echo Protocol wasn't just individual mind control. It was beta testing for something much larger. Every modified subject was a node in a network. Every programmed behaviour was a data point in a massive psychological mapping project. They weren't just changing people. They were learning how to change society itself, one mind at a time. The ultimate goal wasn't creating individual assets like the old MKUL TRA program. It was creating a population that would voluntarily surrender their autonomy, their privacy, their capacity for independent thought. And it was working. I thought about all the people I'd seen walking around like zombies, staring at their phones, consuming whatever content the algorithms fed them, believing whatever their social media feeds told them to believe. How many of them had been through programs like ECHO? How many were unwitting carriers of programmed behaviours? How many of them were still human in any meaningful sense? The scariest part wasn't that the technology existed, it was how willingly people accepted it. They traded their mental freedom for convenience, their privacy for entertainment, their autonomy for the illusion of connection. They weren't victims of a conspiracy, they were customers. That night I made a decision. I couldn't expose ECHO protocol through traditional journalism. They'd proved that was impossible. But I could do something else. I could become living proof of what they were doing. I started documenting everything. The targeted ads, the environmental triggers, the social manipulation, the systematic isolation. I recorded video messages to myself, wrote detailed journals and hid copies everywhere I could think of. Not to expose them, That was impossible. But to leave a record for whoever came next. Because there would be others, other journalists, other investigators, other people who stumbled across the truth and found themselves targeted by Echo Protocol. Maybe one of them would be smarter than me. Maybe one of them would find a way to fight back that I couldn't imagine. Or maybe they'd just end up like me, homeless, paranoid, talking to themselves in parking lots, while the world continued its sleepwalk toward voluntary servitude. 3 months later, I was sitting in another diner in another city when I saw the news report. Local journalist Cal Monroe was found dead in his vehicle early this morning, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Monroe had reportedly been struggling with mental health issues following the suicide of a close friend earlier this year. He leaves behind no immediate family. I watched my own obituary on the television screen, feeling strangely detached. The photo they used was from my old press credentials. I looked younger, healthier, more hopeful, like someone who still believed in the possibility of truth. The reporter mentioned that I'd been working on a story about government surveillance before my breakdown, but that the work had been discredited as the product of paranoid delusions. They killed Cal Monroe without firing a shot, but I was still alive, at least in some sense. I had no identity, no connections, no official existence, but I was still breathing, still thinking, still remembering. For now. I finished my coffee and walked out into the morning sun, another homeless crazy person with stories no one would believe. In my pocket was a small notebook where I'd written everything I could remember about being Cal Monroe. Tonight, I'd add another entry. Tomorrow I'd probably forget to. But for this moment I still knew who I was and what I'd discovered. The program had evolved, but it hadn't won. Not completely. Not yet. As I walked down the street, I passed a bus stop where a digital billboard was advertising a new smartphone app. Mind Ease, Advanced Mental Health Support Through AI-Powered Therapy. The tagline read, "Let us help you become your best self." I almost laughed. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I pulled out my phone, an ancient flip phone I'd bought with cash, and noticed something interesting. Despite being a basic model with no internet connection, it was showing a text message I'd never received. Your thoughts are not your own. Your memories can be adjusted. You want to comply. You need to comply. The same phrases from the Aeon Metric sessions. I looked around the busy street at all the people walking past with their heads down, staring at their screens, oblivious to everything around them. How many of them were seeing the same message? How many would comply without even realizing they were being programmed? The future wasn't some dystopian science fiction scenario where jackbooted thugs dragged people away for reprogramming. It was much more elegant than that. The future was a world where people begged to be controlled, paid for the privilege, and thanked their controllers for the service. And according to my phone, that future was now. I dropped the device in a trash can and kept walking. Somewhere behind me I could hear the sound of 1,000 notifications chiming in perfect unison, like a digital choir singing humanity to sleep. The program never ended, it just got better at hiding. This is his account of what lies beneath Area 52. My name is Cal Monroe. I'm 33 years old, ex-Air Force avionics technician, and for the past 5 years, I've made a decent living as a private defense contractor. I fix things that fly, things that shouldn't fly, and occasionally things that definitely don't fly but somehow do anyway. I thought I'd seen everything the military-industrial complex had to offer. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Unknown number, but the voice was crisp, professional, government-trained. "Mr. Monroe, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I represent a joint task force conducting classified operations research. Your security clearance and technical expertise have brought you to our attention for a temporary but high-priority assignment." I'd heard this song before. Black budget projects, need-to-know basis, substantial compensation for keeping your mouth shut. But something in her tone was different. There was an undercurrent of urgency, fear. I couldn't place it. "Where and when?" I asked. "Location will be disclosed upon acceptance. Duration, 2 weeks maximum. Compensation, $50,000 plus hazard pay. 50 grand for 2 weeks. That was nearly double my usual rate. Red flags should have been waving, but the number was too good to ignore. My ex-wife's alimony payments weren't getting any smaller. I'm listening. The paperwork arrived by courier within 2 hours. I'd never seen NDAs this comprehensive. Digital signature pads that displayed the documents for exactly 60 seconds before wiping clean. Multiple biometric scans. Even a psychological evaluation that asked questions like, have you ever experienced temporal displacement? And rate your comfort level with non-terrestrial phenomena on a scale of 1 to 10. The strangest part was the location designation. Grid K22, Tonopah Test Range Complex, Nevada. Not Groom Lake, not Area 51. Somewhere else entirely. Dr. Chen called back that evening. Mr. Monroe, are you familiar with misdirection theory? In what context? In the context of public attention. Area 51 has been in the public consciousness for decades. Books, movies, documentaries. Everyone knows about Groom Lake. Your point? My point, Mr. Monroe, is that Area 51 is the misdirection. Area 52 is the vault. 3 days later, I was on an unmarked charter flight from McCarran Airport to Tonopah. No other passengers, no flight attendant. Just me and a pilot who never spoke. The landscape below shifted from Vegas sprawl to endless desert, then to mountains that seemed to go on forever. We landed on a strip I couldn't find on any map. A black SUV waited, engine running. The driver was military. That much was obvious from his posture and the way his eyes never stopped moving. He handed me a tablet with a single document. Temporary assignment brief. Classification level. UMBRACLEAR. Umbra? I asked. Above top secret, he said. His voice sounded like he gargled gravel. You'll be working with 3 other contractors. Your job is simple. Maintain power grid integrity for Zone Echo 9. Don't ask questions about what's in Echo 9. Don't try to access Echo 9 without clearance. Don't discuss Echo 9 with anyone outside your assigned team. We drove for 20 minutes through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. No roads, just tyre tracks in the sand. Finally, we reached what looked like a mining operation. Corrugated metal buildings, a few trucks, some kind of elevator shaft descending into the mountain. The elevator had no buttons, no controls, no floor indicator, just smooth steel walls and a humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The military escort, I never got his name, stood silent as we descended, and descended and descended, and I counted. 19 levels down, the elevator finally stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. Polished white walls, LED strips running along the ceiling, and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. 3 other contractors were waiting in what looked like a briefing room. Maria Santos, electrical engineer from Lockheed, Tom Brady, no relation to the quarterback he was quick to point out, systems analyst from Raytheon, and Jennifer Walsh, computer specialist whose previous work was so classified she couldn't tell us who she'd worked for. The briefing was conducted by a man who introduced himself only as Director Hayes, tall, grey-haired, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. Ladies and gentlemen, you're here to maintain critical infrastructure for Project Kairos. What that project involves is not your concern. Your job is to ensure uninterrupted power flow to Zone Echo 9 and to report any anomalies immediately. Tom raised his hand. What kind of anomalies should we expect? Hayes stared at him for a long moment. The kind you don't ask questions about, Mr. Brady. He led us through a series of corridors to what he called the technical sector. Banks of monitors, server racks and control panels that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. At the centre of it all was a massive power distribution hub feeding something deeper in the complex. Zone Echo 9 requires constant power, Hayes explained. Any interruption longer than 30 seconds triggers automatic lockdown procedures. You don't want lockdown procedures to trigger. Why? Jennifer asked. Hayes looked at her the same way he'd looked at Tom. Because, Miss Walsh, lockdown procedures have never been tested, and we'd prefer to keep it that way. My shift started at midnight. The night crew was just me and Jennifer. Maria and Tom worked days. The complex felt different at night. Sounds carried farther. Shadows seemed deeper. and there was a vibration in the floor so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But I was always paying attention. The power readings for Echo 9 were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The zone was drawing nearly a megawatt continuously, but the consumption patterns were irregular, spikes and valleys that followed no logical sequence. It reminded me of a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be measured in kilowatts. Jennifer was monitoring the security feeds from her station, 12 screens showing various corridors and rooms throughout the complex. But I noticed something odd about the Echo 9 feeds. They had a 6-second delay. Every other camera was real time, but the Echo 9 feeds looped the same 6 seconds over and over. "Hey Jen, you seeing this camera glitch?" She looked up from her work. "What glitch?" I pointed to the monitor. "Echo 9, camera 7, it's looping." She frowned, typed something into her console. "System shows all cameras functioning normally." But I could see it. The same security guard walking past the same door at the exact same moment, every 6 seconds. Like a GIF that never quite loaded properly. On my third night, the temperature started fluctuating. The complex maintained a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but my workstation kept shifting between freezing and sweltering. I checked the HVAC systems, all normal, but something was wrong. That's when I first saw the symbols. They were etched into the side of a server rack, symbols that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They looked almost like circuit diagrams, but wrong. Organic. Like someone had tried to draw electronics using biological principles. I was examining them with a flashlight when I heard Jennifer gasp. "Cal, you need to see this." One of the Echo 9 corridor feeds had changed. Instead of the looping security guard, it showed an empty hallway. And at the end of that hallway, a door that was slowly opening. "That door's not supposed to open," Jennifer whispered. Through the opening we could see movement. Not walking movement, flowing movement. Like liquid light was pouring through the doorway. Then the feed cut to black. When it came back 30 seconds later, it was the same looping security guard, walking past the same closed door. But in that brief moment, I had seen something that changed everything. In the reflection on the polished floor just before the feed died, I saw an eye. Massive, silver, and definitely not human. It wasn't a ship in Echo 9, it was alive, and it had seen us watching. Tom Brady didn't show up for his shift on Thursday morning. Jennifer and I waited until 8 a.m. before calling Director Hayes. "Mr. Brady has been reassigned," Hayes said without explanation. "Continue your duties." But Tom's personal effects were still in the break room. His coffee mug was still half full. His jacket was draped over his chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment. Maria started acting strange that afternoon. She kept muttering to herself, checking the same readouts over and over. When I asked if everything was okay, she looked at me like she didn't recognise me for a moment. "The numbers don't add up," she said. "We're feeding Echo 9 enough power to run a small city, but the thermal output is all wrong. It's like the energy is going somewhere else." "Somewhere else like where?" "Somewhere else like not here." That night the emergency siren started blaring at 2:17 a.m, deafening klaxons that made your teeth ache. Jennifer and I looked at each other in panic. Was this the lockdown Hayes had warned us about? Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the siren stopped. Not gradually, they just cut off mid-wail, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Director Hayes appeared in our control room 5 minutes later, looking shaken but trying to hide it. "False alarm," he said. "Continue your duties." But I noticed he wouldn't make eye contact, and his hands were trembling. The next day, Maria didn't show up either. Reassigned, according to Hayes. But her car was still in the parking structure on level 2. Jennifer was barely holding it together. We were the only contractors left, and the weight of whatever was happening in Echo 9 was crushing both of us. She started accessing systems she wasn't supposed to touch, using admin passwords she shouldn't have known. "Jen, what are you doing?" "Finding answers," she said, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Tom gave me his access codes before he disappeared, told me something was wrong with the whole project." She pulled up internal communications, memoranda stamped with classification levels I'd never seen before. Umbra Clear was apparently the bottom tier. Above that was Majestic, then Zodiac, then classifications that were just numbers and symbols. One document caught my attention. Project Kairos, Phase 3 Implementation Status. The bioconductive interface has exceeded all expectations. Subject demonstrates rapid adaptation to containment protocols and has begun influencing local electromagnetic fields. Recommend immediate escalation of consciousness mapping procedures. Bioconductive interface. Subject. The thing in Echo 9 wasn't a ship or a piece of technology, it was a living being, and we were feeding it power. Another document, dated 3 days earlier. Minor containment fluctuation at 0217 hours. Subject achieved brief sensory extension beyond Echo 9 barriers. Security protocols held, but recommend enhanced isolation measures. Note: 3 personnel reported temporal displacement sensations during the event. Temporal displacement, the looping camera feeds, the missing contractors. Jennifer kept digging, and what she found made both of us understand why Tom and Maria had really vanished. A memo marked Operation Mirror Veil, historical context. Analysis of recovered materials suggests extra-dimensional rather than extraterrestrial origin. Entities exist outside linear temporal experience and demonstrate ability to manipulate local space-time fabric. Primary subject may not be an individual organism, but rather a projection or echo of a larger consciousness existing in parallel dimensional space. They weren't from another planet, they were from outside reality itself. Warning: prolonged exposure to subject may result in consciousness fragmentation, temporal perception anomalies, and in extreme cases complete displacement from baseline reality. Personnel experiencing symptoms should report immediately for neural recalibration. Neural recalibration. That's what happened to Tom and Maria. They hadn't been reassigned. They'd been broken by contact with whatever was in Echo 9. Jennifer was reading over my shoulder, her breathing getting faster and more shallow. "Cal," she whispered, "look at the date on this document." It was dated 6 months in the future. The older archives were stored in a vault I wasn't supposed to access, but Jennifer's hacking skills were getting desperate and creative. She'd found references to something called Operation Mirror Veil, a predecessor to Project Kairos that dated back to the 1970s. The files told a story that made my blood run cold. In 1978, a survey team at Tonopah detected unusual seismic activity. Not earthquakes, but something else. Tremors that seemed to follow mathematical patterns. Ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomalous void approximately 200 feet beneath the mountain, but when they drilled down to investigate, they found something impossible. The void was bigger on the inside than on the outside. The first recovery team brought back samples of what they thought was exotic matter, materials that didn't conform to known physics, but the materials weren't stable in our reality. They flickered in and out of existence, sometimes vanishing for hours before reappearing in a different location. That's when they realized they weren't dealing with alien technology. They were dealing with something that existed between dimensions, using our reality as an anchor point. The breakthrough came in 1983 when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist working on Project Looking Glass, hypothesized that the entity was a reflection of human consciousness itself, not what we are, but what we could become if we existed outside the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. The entity demonstrates knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and memories of possibilities that may never happen. It exists in a state of quantum superposition, experiencing all potential outcomes simultaneously. In effect, it is us, evolved beyond the limitations of singular timeline existence. But the most disturbing file was Dr. Vasquez's final report, dated just days before her own mysterious disappearance. The entity is not malevolent, but it is incompatible with baseline human consciousness. Contact results in expansion of awareness beyond what the human mind can process. Subjects begin perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing past and future as present reality. The mind fractures under the weight of infinite possibility. We are not studying an alien intelligence. We are studying our own future, and that future is trying to communicate with us across dimensions we cannot comprehend. Recommendation: immediate cessation of all contact protocols. The entity's attempts at communication are causing reality fluctuations that may result in permanent temporal displacement of personnel. It is not trying to harm us, it is trying to save us, but salvation from its perspective means joining it in its multidimensional existence. We are not ready. Humanity is not ready. Perhaps we never will be. The final line of her report chilled me to the bone. They are not invaders, they are echoes of what we already were. Jennifer found Dr. Vasquez's personal logs hidden in an encrypted partition that should have been impossible to access. The encryption was 40 years old, but somehow the files were updating themselves in real time. Day 1. First direct communication attempt. Entity projects images directly into visual cortex. I see myself, but not myself. Versions of Elena Vasquez that exist in parallel timelines. In one, I never became a physicist. In another, I died in childhood. In a third, I am something that transcends human categorization entirely. Day 3. Time displacement events increasing. Experienced memories of conversations that haven't happened yet. Entity is teaching me to perceive beyond linear causality. It's beautiful and terrifying. Day 7. I understand now. They're not from there, because there is no there. They exist in the spaces between possibilities. They are what we become when we evolve beyond the need for singular reality. Day 12. The others don't understand. They think containment is possible, that we can study and control something that exists outside the concept of control. They're going to get people killed. Day 18. I can see the breach coming. 3 days from now, the entity will attempt to return to its dimensional matrix, but our containment protocols will interfere with the translation. The resulting paradox will create a reality fissure. I have to stop them, but I may already be too late. Time isn't working properly anymore. I keep experiencing this moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The logs ended there, but they were still updating. New entries appeared as we watched. Day 7305, still trying to warn them. Elena variants across multiple timelines attempting intervention. Breach inevitable. Cal Monroe will survive, but survival is relative when reality becomes negotiable. Jennifer and I stared at the screen in horror. Dr. Vasquez had been missing for 40 years, but somehow she was still writing reports. That's when the lights went out. Not gradually, they snapped off like someone had thrown a switch. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but we were left in absolute darkness. The only sound was the humming of the power grid, and even that was changing pitch, becoming something organic and musical. Then Jennifer screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight and found her standing rigid, staring at something I couldn't see. Her eyes were wide and silver, reflecting light that wasn't there. "Cal," she whispered, but her voice sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. "It's getting out." The corridor behind us was changing. The walls were flowing like water, stretching and contracting, and through the shifting architecture something was moving, not walking, sliding, like liquid mercury with purpose. I grabbed Jennifer's arm, but my hand passed through her. She was there, but not solid, flickering between dimensions like the exotic matter from the old files. "Run," she said, and her voice was fading. "It's not trying to hurt us, but we can't exist in the same space when the boundaries collapse." The entity emerged from Echo 9, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't silver or liquid or light. It was all of those things and none of them. It was possibility given form, consciousness without the limitations of physical existence. But looking at it directly was like staring into a mirror that showed you every version of yourself that had ever existed, or ever could exist. I saw Cal Monroe the child, Cal Monroe the old man, Cal Monroe who had never been born, Cal Monroe who had become something beyond human understanding. The security guards were there one moment and gone the next, not killed, but displaced. I watched them step backward through walls that had become permeable, their screams echoing from distances that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I ran, down corridors that folded in on themselves, past rooms that were bigger inside than outside, through a facility that was reshaping itself according to rules I couldn't comprehend. My watch was recording everything on its built-in camera, military-grade equipment designed to function in electromagnetic interference. If I survived, at least there would be proof, if survival had any meaning when reality itself was in question. I found an elevator, the same elevator I'd taken down 19 levels, except now it was in a corridor that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. The button panel was melting and reforming, showing floor numbers that shifted between digits and symbols and sometimes weren't there at all. But it was the only way up. The elevator rose with the same smooth hum as before, but when the doors opened, I was back in the same corridor I'd just left. Same melting walls, same impossible geometry, same feeling that I was being watched by something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. I tried again. Same result. And again. Same corridor. The entity wasn't trying to trap me, it was trying to communicate, but communication required shared reference points, and we had none. Its attempts to make contact were causing reality to loop, creating temporal echoes that reflected my own desperation back at me. I was experiencing the same moment from multiple timelines simultaneously, just like Dr. Vasquez had described. In one timeline, I was still at my workstation, watching the power readings spike. In another, I had never taken the job. In a third, I was something else entirely, something that could perceive the entity without fracturing. But in this timeline, the one where I was still human, I was trapped in a loop between the 19th floor and somewhere that had no floor number at all. My watch battery was dying, but I kept recording. If someone found the footage, maybe they could understand what had happened. Maybe they could learn from our mistake. I sat down in the corridor that kept changing around me and tried to make sense of the past week. The missing contractors, the looping security feeds, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. It had all been the entity trying to communicate across dimensional barriers. Tom and Maria hadn't been reassigned. They'd been translated, shifted into a version of reality where they could coexist with something that existed outside linear time. They were still alive, but not in any way that baseline humanity could recognize. The entity appeared again, flowing through the wall like mercury through a membrane. But this time, instead of the overwhelming multiplicity of its full presence, it showed me a single image. Doctor. Elena Vasquez. Not as she had been 40 years ago, but as she was now, existing simultaneously across multiple timelines, still trying to warn people about a breach that was both inevitable and had already happened. She looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness and spoke with a voice that echoed from past and future simultaneously. "You're already out, Cal, but you haven't left." Then the corridor collapsed into itself and everything went dark. Document recovered from the personal effects of Inspector Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Special Investigations Unit, following his death by apparent suicide in 2025. Classification level UMBRA/CLEAR/EYESONLY. Inspector Webb's final report dictated to voice recorder: "I've been investigating disappearances at classified facilities for 15 years. Missing persons, equipment failures, cover-ups, it's all part of the job. But the Cal Monroe case is different. The official story is that Mr. Monroe was killed in an industrial accident at Tonopah Test Range on March 18th, 2024. Electrical fire, they said. Nothing recoverable. But 3 days ago, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a storage device, military grade, designed to survive electromagnetic pulses and extreme temperatures, the kind of thing that costs more than my annual salary. Attached was a note: Zone Echo 9 debrief Cal Monroe. I've watched the footage 17 times now. I've had it analysed by the best experts available. They all say the same thing: it's impossible to fake. The metadata confirms it was recorded at Tonopah on the dates in question. But the content, the footage shows a man running through corridors that shift and change like living tissue. It shows walls flowing like water, and shadows that move independently of any light source. It shows something that my mind keeps trying to rationalise as special effects or hallucination, but the technical analysis proves otherwise. And at the end, God help me. At the end of the footage, there's a moment where Monroe turns the camera on himself. He's standing in what appears to be an elevator that's somehow larger inside than outside. His face is calm, resigned as he speaks directly into the lens. If you're watching this, then the loop finally broke. I'm uploading this to the emergency buffer in my boot drive. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand. Then he turns the camera back toward the corridor and there's something there. Something that doesn't belong in our reality. For just a moment it's visible, a reflection of consciousness itself, existing in dimensions we can't perceive. But here's what's keeping me awake at night. In that final frame, just before the recording ends, you can see Monroe's reflection in the polished wall behind him. And standing next to his reflection, clear as day, is another figure. It's me, Inspector Marcus Webb, wearing the same clothes I'm wearing right now, staring directly into the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The timestamp on that footage is today's date. I'm going to submit this report and then take some time off. Maybe visit my sister in Oregon, get away from all this classified nonsense for a while. clear my head. But I keep thinking about what Monroe said in his final log entry. They're not from somewhere else, they're from someone else, and someone else is now. End of recorded statement. Inspector Webb was found dead in his office 12 hours after submitting this report. Official cause of death, suicide by gunshot. Unofficial note, the security cameras in his office show him alone at the time of death, but the audio pickup clearly records two distinct voices. The second voice, according to forensic analysis, matches the vocal patterns of Cal Monroe. The storage device mentioned in Webb's report was never recovered from the scene. Zone Echo 9 remains operational. 3 months later, deep space monitoring stations began detecting an unusual signal, a transmission that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. When decoded, it contained a single message, repeating endlessly, "This is Cal Monroe, Contractor ID 7749, reporting from Zone Echo 9. The breach has been contained, but containment is relative when dealing with entities that exist outside linear causality. To anyone receiving this transmission, Area 52 is not a place. It's a state of being, and that state is contagious. If you're investigating disappearances at classified facilities, stop. If you're experiencing temporal displacement sensations, seek help immediately. If you're reading reports about Project Kairos or Operation Mirror Veil, you may already be compromised. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to save us from ourselves by showing us what we could become. But evolution forced upon consciousness that isn't ready results in fracturing of identity across multiple timelines. I'm still here, I'm always here. Time isn't working properly anymore, so here and there and when don't mean what they used to mean. To my family, I'm sorry I can't come home. Home is a temporal location, and I exist in all temporal locations simultaneously now. To the researchers, stop trying to contain what cannot be contained. The entity doesn't want to invade our reality, it wants to invite us into its own. But the invitation is dangerous because we're not ready to exist outside singular timeline experience. To future investigators, the truth about Area 52 isn't hidden underground in Nevada. It's hidden in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between what is and what could be. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can see those gaps opening. This is Cal Monroe signing off from everywhere and nowhere. Take care of each other. Trust me when I tell you that love is the only thing that exists consistently across all timelines. See you around. Or maybe I already have. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains in 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled the Evening Autoton, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around -20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 meters away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zinaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manasseh people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogorova's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, Recovered journal entry, classification redacted. Subject, Eli Granger, independent journalist. Date range, July 15th to 18th, 2023. Location, Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California. The following document was recovered from an encrypted server farm in Iceland. The journalist's current whereabouts remain unknown. Ed. My name is Eli Granger, and I'm writing this because I may not live long enough to tell it in person. What I witnessed in the redwoods of Northern California will haunt me until my dying day, whenever that may come. It started 3 weeks ago with an email that shouldn't have existed. I was in my cramped Oakland apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee, and scrolling through encrypted channels where whistleblowers sometimes surface. My secure inbox pinged. A message from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters, routed through 7 different proxy servers. No subject line, just an attachment and 4 lines of text. You want truth? Go to the redwoods. Bring a black suit and a quiet soul. July 15th to 18th. The fire reveals all. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be a guest registry for the Bohemian Grove. That mysterious all-male retreat where the world's most powerful men allegedly gather each summer to commune with nature. I'd written about the Grove before, relying on second-hand accounts and leaked photographs from the 1980s. But this was different. The names on the list made my blood run cold. Former presidents, current senators, military contractors whose companies I'd been investigating for years, CEOs of tech giants, pharmaceutical corporations, defense contractors, media moguls who controlled the narrative of entire nations, all scheduled to attend something called the Midsummer Encampment. At the bottom of the scan was a forged access pass with my photograph, a professional headshot I'd never sent to anyone, digitally altered to show me in a black suit and tie. The name read Edmund Gray, Logistics Consultant, Prometheus Industries. Someone with serious resources wanted me inside that grove. The question was why? I should have walked away. Should have deleted the email and gone back to writing about municipal corruption and corporate tax avoidance. Safe stories. Stories that didn't get journalists killed. Instead, I packed a black suit and drove north to Sonoma County. The road to Monterey winds through some of the most beautiful country in California. Ancient redwoods tower over narrow highways, their canopy so thick that midday feels like twilight. It's the kind of place where you'd expect to find hippie communes and organic wineries, not shadowy cabals plotting the fate of nations. But as I learned in my Navy intelligence days, the most dangerous secrets are always hidden in the most innocent places. I parked at a motel in Gurneyville and walked the perimeter of the Bohemian Grove property that evening. 2,000 acres of private forest, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras every 50 feet, motion sensors in the trees, the kind of setup you'd expect around a military installation, not a summer camp for rich men. The main gate was staffed by guards who looked more like special forces operators than private security. Black uniforms, tactical gear, the flat stare of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Whatever happened inside those redwoods, they were serious about keeping it secret. The forged pass worked perfectly, too perfectly. The guards scanned the barcode, checked my face against the photo, and waved me through without a second glance. Either the forger was a genius, or someone very powerful wanted me inside. Neither possibility was comforting. The grove itself was exactly as described in the leaked accounts I'd read. Massive redwood trees, some over 1,000 years old, stretched toward a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. Gravel paths wound between rustic cabins and open-air lodges, each marked with whimsical names: Owl's Nest, Dragon's Den, Caveman's Lodge. It would have been charming if not for the underlying sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The other guests, I couldn't think of them as normal people, not after seeing that registry, moved through this camp with the easy confidence of men accustomed to absolute power. They wore casual clothes during the day, khakis, polo shirts, boat shoes, the uniform of American aristocracy. But their conversations, caught in fragments as I passed, revealed the true scope of their influence. The Shanghai Index will drop exactly 17%. Tell the secretary that Operation Nightfall is greenlit for October. Media blackout should hold for at least 72 hours. I posed as a logistics consultant, which gave me an excuse to wander the grounds with a clipboard and camera phone, confiscated at the gate and replaced with an approved device that couldn't access external networks. The cover story worked well enough. Rich men are accustomed to being served by invisible people who handle the mundane details of their lives. But as the day wore on, I began to notice the symbols. Owls everywhere, carved into tree trunks, etched on building facades, worked into the designs of benches and lampposts. Not cute, friendly owls. These were stylized, angular, with eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked past. The largest was a 40-foot stone statue positioned on a small island in an artificial lake at the heart of the grove. Even in daylight, it radiated a sense of ancient malevolence. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find a man in his 70s watching me stare at the giant owl. Silver hair, expensive casual wear, the kind of artificial tan that comes from winters in Palm Beach. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colourless. The Owl of Bohemia, he continued, joining me at the lake's edge. Been watching over this place for over a century. Some say it's just decorative, others know better. Know better how? I asked, immediately regretting the question. I was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable. The old man smiled, revealing teeth too white and too perfect for his age. You'll see tonight, Mr. Gray. The cremation of care waits for no man, not even consultants. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at the owl statue and wondering how much my cover had already been blown. That evening, as twilight settled over the grove, the atmosphere changed completely. The casual bonhomie of the day disappeared, replaced by something far more serious and ritualistic. Men emerged from their cabins wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. Some carried torches, others strange ceremonial objects I couldn't identify. I found a dark robe hanging in my assigned cabin, along with a note. Attendance is mandatory. Silence is sacred. The owl sees all. What I witnessed that night will stay with me forever. As darkness fell, hundreds of robed figures processed through the forest paths, converging on the lake where the great owl statue loomed. Torches flickered between the trees like malevolent fireflies. The only sounds were footsteps on gravel and the whisper of fabric against bark. I followed the crowd, keeping my head down and my hood up. The robe smelled of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. We gathered in a natural amphitheatre around the lake. The owl statue dominated the scene, its eyes seeming to glow red in the torchlight. A wooden boat had been prepared at the water's edge, and in it lay what appeared to be the effigy of a child, small, wrapped in white cloth, disturbingly lifelike. But as I stared at the bundle, a horrible doubt crept into my mind. The proportions were too perfect, the weight distribution too natural. The way the cloth clung to what lay beneath suggested something more substantial than straw and sawdust. A figure in an elaborate robe stepped onto a platform beside the owl. Even with his face hidden, I recognised the bearing and voice of a man who'd been on television every night for years. A former president whose policies had shaped a generation. Brothers of the Grove, his voice boomed across the water, amplified by hidden speakers. We gather once again beneath the ancient eyes of wisdom to perform the sacred rite that frees us from the burdens of conscience. The crowd responded in unison. We banish care and cast it to the flames. Care, that pale and common thing that binds the hands of power. Care that whispers doubt in the ears of decision. Care that stays the sword of necessary action. We banish care and cast it to the flames. The ritualized call and response continued for nearly an hour. Invocations to ancient deities whose names I recognized from my study of Middle Eastern mythology. Moloch, the Carthaginian god of child sacrifice. Enlil, the Mesopotamian lord of wind and authority. Names that shouldn't have been spoken by American leaders in the 21st century. But the most disturbing element wasn't the pagan imagery, or even the suggestions of child sacrifice. It was the casual way these men, titans of industry, shapers of policy, guardians of democracy, participated in rituals that explicitly celebrated the abandonment of human compassion. The ceremony reached its climax when the boat carrying the effigy was pushed out onto the lake. Flames erupted from the water around it, hidden gas jets, I realised, creating the illusion of supernatural fire. The figure in the boat burned quickly, the white cloth falling away to reveal... I still can't be certain what I saw. In the flickering light, with smoke obscuring my vision and my mind reeling from the horror of it all, it might have been an elaborately constructed mannequin. The realistic movement could have been caused by the flames consuming internal supports. The sounds, brief, high-pitched, quickly cut off, might have been air escaping from burning materials. But the way some of the robed figures wept as the fire consumed its offering, the way others cheered with genuine ecstasy, suggested something far more sinister than theatrical pageantry. As the flames died down, the crowd began to disperse. I started to follow them back toward the cabins, but a hand fell on my shoulder. Mr. Grey. It was the old man from earlier, still wearing his ceremonial robes. You're invited to the inner circle gathering. A rare honour for a consultant. Before I could refuse, two other figures flanked me. Not threatening exactly, but their presence made it clear that declining wasn't an option. They led me deeper into the forest, away from the main paths, to a clearing I hadn't seen during my earlier reconnaissance. Here, perhaps 30 men stood in a circle around a fire pit carved directly into the bedrock. Unlike the theatrical grandeur of the main ceremony, this felt ancient and deadly serious. The inner circle ritual began at midnight. The participants had exchanged their dark robes for masks of polished bone, owl faces with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into your soul. They moved with practiced precision, suggesting this ceremony had been performed countless times before. The man who'd led the earlier ritual stepped into the centre of the circle. Without his presidential bearing and familiar voice, he seemed diminished, just another acolyte serving powers older than nations. "Brothers of the Inner Grove," he intoned, "we gather to receive the wisdom of the Ancient Ones, and to consecrate the plans that will shape the world's destiny." The response came in a language I didn't recognise at first, harsh consonants and guttural vowels that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something primal and terrified in the human psyche. But as my Navy intelligence training kicked in, I began to parse familiar elements. This was Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, dead for over 2,000 years. They were chanting the names of forgotten gods and promising them sacrifices of nations. Symbols were drawn in the ash around the fire pit, not random occult doodles, but specific sigils I recognised from declassified CIA documents. Project MK-Ultra had experimented with ritualistic programming, using ancient symbols and dead languages to bypass conscious resistance in human subjects. The research had supposedly been discontinued in the 1970s. Apparently it had just moved to a more exclusive venue. The ceremony continued for hours. Maps were produced and spread on the ground, not of geographical territories, but of economic zones, resource deposits, population centres. Plans were discussed in mixture of English and Akkadian, but the intent was clear enough. Wars to be started, governments to be toppled, populations to be controlled. And through it all, the participants spoke of themselves not as American leaders serving American interests, but as servants of the Ancient Ones, preparing the world for some greater transformation. "The harvest approaches," one masked figure intoned. "The sleepers must be awakened. The old seals must be broken." "In the name of those who wait in the deep places," the circle responded, "let the work continue." I crouched in the shadows beyond the firelight, recording everything on a digital audio device I'd hidden in my shoe. But as the night wore on, I began to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't just corruption or conspiracy in any conventional sense. These men genuinely believed they were serving inhuman masters. Whether those masters were real or imagined didn't matter. The policies they were planning would affect millions of lives based on the whims of entities that viewed humanity as livestock. The ritual concluded with each participant drinking from a silver chalice and making individual pledges. The liquid looked black in the firelight, and several men convulsed briefly after drinking, their eyes rolling back to show only white. As dawn approached, the circle dissolved. The participants removed their masks, revealed themselves to be exactly who I'd suspected. Former presidents, current senators, military leaders, corporate titans. They shook hands and exchanged quiet words like businessmen concluding a profitable meeting, which in a sense they were. I made it back to my cabin as the first light filtered through the redwood canopy, but I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Whatever protection my forged identity provided was wearing thin. Too many meaningful looks, too many knowing smiles. They were playing with me, letting me see just enough to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. But there was one more place I needed to investigate before I could flee. The lodge marked Styx, access by code only, sat apart from the main camp, connected by a service road that didn't appear on any of the maps provided to guests. I'd noticed it during my first day's reconnaissance, but hadn't found an opportunity to investigate. The building itself was unremarkable. Standard wooden construction that matched the other lodges, designed to blend into the forest environment. But the security was anything but standard. Biometric scanners, electromagnetic locks, motion sensors that could detect a heartbeat from 50 feet away. Fortunately, my anonymous benefactor had provided more than just a forged access pass. Hidden in the lining of my suit jacket was a USB device that looked like a standard thumb drive, but contained sophisticated hacking tools developed by someone with serious technical skills. When plugged into the lodge's security system, It created a temporary blind spot in the sensors and provided the access codes needed to bypass the locks. Whoever wanted me to see what lay inside had planned this infiltration down to the smallest detail. The lodge's interior was a facade. Behind a false wall accessed by yet another hidden panel, stairs led down into the bedrock beneath the forest. The passage was older than the buildings above, carved stone rather than modern construction, lit by electric fixtures that had been retrofitted into ancient sconces. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy oak door opened onto a chamber that took my breath away. The room stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the lodge's footprint above. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound journals, rolled documents, and artefacts that seemed to span centuries. At the centre of the chamber stood a massive table carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface covered with maps, blueprints, and what appeared to be governmental documents bearing official seals. I started with the journals, selecting one at random from a shelf marked 1923 to 1945. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, but the contents were anything but quaint. The European situation proceeds according to plan. Our associates in Berlin understand their role, though they believe themselves to be serving the fatherland rather than the ancient ones. The sacrifice of the lesser peoples will provide the spiritual energy necessary for the next phase of the great work. Another journal, this one more recent. Operation Mockingbird exceeds all expectations. The media outlets respond to our guidance without question, believing they serve journalistic integrity, while actually perpetuating the narratives required for population control. The sleeping masses accept whatever reality we provide. But it was the documents on the central table that truly shattered my understanding of how the world worked. Blueprints for the USA Patriot Act dated 6 months before September 11, 2001. Battle plans for the invasion of Iraq, complete with fabricated intelligence reports about weapons of mass destruction. Early drafts of social media algorithms designed not to connect people, but to divide them into manageable, controllable factions. And newer documents that made my blood run cold. Plans for a global pandemic response that prioritized control over public health. Blueprints for digital currency systems that would eliminate financial privacy entirely. Population reduction strategies disguised as environmental initiatives. The most disturbing document was a roster of participants going back to the 1870s, when the Bohemian Club was first founded. Names I recognised from history textbooks, titans of the Gilded Age who'd shaped America's industrial development. But also names that shouldn't have been there. Figures from much earlier periods, some dating back centuries. Either the record keeping was fantastically inaccurate, or some of these participants weren't entirely human. At the bottom of the most recent page, a note in fresh handwriting. E. Granger, journalist, witnessed Inner Circle ceremony. July 16th, 2023. Asset or liability. Recommend termination if no compliance by dawn July 18th. They knew exactly who I was, had known from the moment I'd walked through their gates, the anonymous email, the forged pass, the convenient access codes. It had all been an elaborate test, and I was apparently failing. A motion sensor somewhere in the chamber beeped softly. Red lights began flashing along the walls. In the distance I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stone stairs. I grabbed as many documents as I could carry, stuffed them into my jacket and looked for another way out. But there was only one exit, and it was about to be filled with very unfriendly people. The footsteps were getting closer. Voices echoed down the stairwell. Professional, clipped. The kind of tactical communication used by military operators. But then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red. And in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. A voice speaking directly into my mind, words that bypassed my ears entirely. Run, little journalist. Run and tell the world what you've seen, but know that the telling will be your doom, and the world's salvation requires far greater sacrifices than one man's life. When the emergency light stabilised, a section of the stone wall had opened, revealing a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the earth. I didn't hesitate. Whatever entity had just spoken to me, whether it was one of the ancient ones or something else entirely. It was offering me a chance to escape. I took it. The tunnel system beneath the grove was extensive and clearly ancient. Carved passages connected natural caves, creating a network that probably extended for miles underground. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those I'd seen during the inner circle ceremony, but these were older, deeper, worn smooth by centuries of whatever had moved through these spaces. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, guided by phosphorescent moss that provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, voices, flashlight beams, the occasional echo of radio communication, but the sounds were growing fainter, suggesting that my pursuers either couldn't find the tunnel entrance or were reluctant to follow me into the deep places beneath the forest. Eventually the passage began to slope upward. Fresh air carried the scent of rain and growing things. A natural opening concealed by hanging vines led out into the forest several miles from the main grove compound. I emerged to find the sky filled with storm clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Perfect cover for an escape, if I could make it to my car before the grove's security forces expanded their search perimeter. But as I made my way through the forest, I realized I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the trees, not the tactical teams I'd expected, but something far stranger. They wore the bone-white owl masks from the inner circle ceremony, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. And their eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. "The journalist sees too much," one of them said, the words somehow audible despite the increasing thunder. "The ancient ones are displeased." "But the compact must be honoured," another replied. "He was brought here for a purpose. Let him carry the message to the outer world. Let them know what awaits." I ran. Behind me, inhuman laughter echoed through the forest. Not pursuit exactly, but something far more unsettling. The sound of predators who were confident their prey could never truly escape. I reached my rental car as the storm broke in earnest. Rain pounded the windshield as I drove through the night, taking back roads and avoiding the main highways. In my jacket pocket, the stolen documents felt like they were burning against my chest. But I'd made it out. I had evidence. I had proof of the conspiracy that shaped world events from the shadows of a California forest. Or so I thought. I uploaded everything to an offshore server farm in Iceland. Documents, audio recordings, photographs, detailed notes of everything I'd witnessed. Multiple backup copies, distributed through anonymous networks, protected by military-grade encryption. Within 6 hours, every file had been corrupted or deleted. My apartment was ransacked while I was at an internet cafe, uploading the files. Nothing obviously stolen, but every electronic device had been confiscated or destroyed. My laptop, phone, backup drives, even the digital camera I'd left in a drawer, all gone. The mainstream media ignored my story completely. Alternative news sites that initially showed interest suddenly went silent. Forum posts about the Grove were deleted within minutes of being posted. It was as if the entire internet had been scrubbed of any reference to what I'd discovered. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night since my escape, I've been visited by visions of the Ancient Ones. Vast, tentacled entities that exist in spaces between dimensions, feeding on human suffering and preparing for some cosmic transformation that will remake reality according to their twisted desires. They show me glimpses of the future they're working to create. Cities drowned beneath black oceans, skies filled with screaming winds, populations reduced to cattle serving inhuman masters. And they whisper that I'm not a hero or a journalist or even a victim. I'm a messenger. They wanted someone to witness their ceremony, to understand the scope of their power, to carry word of their inevitable victory to the outside world. Not to warn humanity. Warnings imply the possibility of resistance, but to spread the despair that will make their final conquest easier. Every word I write, every person I tell, every attempt to expose the truth only serves their greater purpose. The corruption of hope, the murder of faith in human institutions, the slow transformation of free people into willing slaves. I'm writing this final entry from a motel room in Reno. I've been driving for 3 days, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. But I know it doesn't matter. They're not hunting me because they don't need to. I'm already serving their purpose just by existing, just by remembering what I saw in the grove. The cremation of care wasn't just a ritual, it was a recruitment ceremony. And I wasn't an infiltrator, I was an initiate. Tonight, I'll drive east toward the desert. Maybe I'll find some way to break the cycle, to turn their own trap against them. Or maybe I'll just disappear into the wasteland and let the truth die with me. But if you're reading this, if somehow these words have reached you despite all their efforts to control the flow of information, then remember this. They call it the cremation of care, but what they really burn is conscience. And when the fires die down, the world grows a little colder, a little darker, a little more ready for the ancient ones to reclaim what they consider their rightful dominion. The fire in the grove never really goes out. It just spreads, invisible and inexorable, consuming everything human until only the shadows remain. And in those shadows something very old and very hungry is waiting to be born.